And we'll go to our first question, please.
Nigel Bellis. In the light of today's announcement of substantial NHS trust deficits, is the NHS sustainable without tax increases or patient contributions?
The deficit is some 2.45 billion. 9 out of 10 nearly are in deficit of the trusts. Emma Reynolds.
There are, as I see it, three big problems for our National Health Service. The first is a cause for celebration, actually, that people are living longer, and that is a good thing. However, people have more complex conditions, and that means that we have more complex treatments. The second and third things are something that the government has done. The second thing that is a big problem is that we had this huge top-down overhaul of the NHS in the last 5 or 6 years, which is a huge distraction. And the third most important thing, really, is the cuts that we've seen in social care, which were incredibly short-sighted because it has caused problems for our hospitals, which is one of the reasons that they're in such financial dire straits, which means that people are not being discharged from hospital because they don't have care packages either in their homes or in care homes. And this has produced a huge financial problem for the NHS. But to come to your question, I think we do need an honest debate about whether we need an increase in taxation if we are to increase spending on the NHS, because I'm not sure, with the current level of spending, which is below the OECD average, below the United States expenditure, and France and Germany and many other countries that are our neighbours spend more on their national health services than we do. And I think we need an honest debate about whether the current situation is sustainable.
Andrea Leadsom.
Well, I think we've tried incredibly hard with the health service to get politicians out the way and to put the decision-making into the hands of health professionals. We've committed to the head of NHS England's plan, where he said he'll need 10 billion extra a year by the end of 2020, and we've committed to providing that funding. So there has been a huge investment, new investment in the NHS, and I think that's really important. I would say that there are three challenges that we have. One is absolutely living longer. Another is the fact that we have so many more treatments and drugs and availability of things that can make people's lives better and sustain their health for longer. And then, of course, the third thing we do have is an incredible rise in the volume of people wanting to use our NHS. So since 2010, we've had 1.9 million more A&E visits. So the demands on the NHS are increasing all the time. So in conclusion, yes, I think we do absolutely need to continue to look at what more we can do to make the NHS effective, but we are funding it, and we're absolutely committed. It's our most precious institution, bar none, and we're absolutely committed to its ongoing success.
Given the projections you've just described and the deficit as it currently is, and we're not that far away from 2020, your answer to the question in terms of either tax increases or patient contributions would be what?
Well, I think the point is that we are adding to the budget for the NHS every year, rising to 10 billion. Well, that was the sum that the head of NHS England, Simon Stevens, said was needed in the NHS to keep things going as it is. I think the problem is the NHS has an ongoing increase in demand for its services, and it may well be that it will need more, but certainly, this government, any government, is completely committed to that.
Dave Nellist.
Well, I don't think it's a problem of overspending. I think it's a problem of underfunding and unrealistic Treasury targets. There's clearly an increase in demand amongst the elderly, and Emma and others have mentioned that. But there's also a disparity in how old people are living. In many cities, certainly in Coventry, we have a 15-year gap between the poorest and the richest areas, and diseases such as diabetes or breathing problems diseases, which affect a lot of people who've been in manual and working class occupations, take more money to treat and to look after. So I'm against this idea which Emma's raised about increasing taxation. I think there's a couple of areas where we could save money in the NHS. Firstly, we could cancel and bring in-house all the PFI contracts, and that would save us £2 billion a year. And secondly, we could nationalise the drug companies who leech off the NHS And that would save us another £3 billion a year. And the final point I would make is that I think in the detail, I haven't had a chance to read all the announcements from today on this issue, but I think in the detail there's a question of agency costs. It's not surprising to me that after years of holding down public sector workers' wages, particularly in the health service, you've got legions of people leaving the health service, then being replaced by more expensive agency staff because the agencies have to make a profit. If we treated health workers, junior doctors and nurses properly, we wouldn't have legions of them leaving the health service.
Lord Patten Service, Michael Gove today in a very widely publicised speech has spoken in this context about the impact in his view of staying in Europe, that the NHS would face additional burdens. He forecasts or says that with 5 countries seeking to be in the European Union, the UK population could increase by up to 5.2 million, he says, by 2030. And then he goes on to say, the idea of asking the NHS to look after a new group of patients equivalent in size to 4 Birminghams is clearly unsustainable.
This speech by Michael Gove is one of the reasons why TUSC was the third organisation which applied to the Electoral Commission to be the main opposition in this debate. So we could have a trade union and socialist sane argument about what are and are not EU issues, and this is not an EU issue, apart from the fact that most of those who've come from the European Union to work in this country tend to be young, tend to be less users of the health service. The real reason we're having a problem with public services is not the recent arrival of those from the EU. It's a 40-year history of a change in our economy. In 1973, coincidentally the year when the UK joined the EEC, this was one of the most equal countries on the planet. Changes of 40 years from Mrs. Thatcher and her 4 sons have meant we're now one of the most unequal. The difference is between 63% of the country's wealth going to working class families and their services to 50% today. That's £250 billion a year. 2.5 times the whole spending on the NHS. What we need is to rebalance the economy in taxation, in wealth production and distribution of that wealth in a socialist direction. Then we can quite easily solve the underfunding of essential public services without having these scare stories from Michael Gove.
Simon Tilbrook. In the light of the Brexit debate, is the credibility of our political class helped by historic references to a plausible World War III or indeed Adolf Hitler?
David Cameron made a speech. I think he didn't use World War III itself. He said it'd be more secure inside the European Union. Boris Johnson said Napoleon, Hitler, various people tried this out, the establishment, that is, of a single authority, and it ended tragically. The EU is an attempt to do this by different methods, which caused quite a furore. Dave Nellist.
Well, again, it's another example, as was the reference to the leader of ISIS being a supporter of the Out campaign, of an attempt to fuddle the debate with bluntly stupid remarks. Now, one of the problems, of course, is that on both sides of this debate, Out and Remain, it's led by Tories, by ex-Tories, by bankers, people who've actually got an overlapping agenda when it comes to things like austerity and the primary role of business and reducing workers' rights and all those sort of things. So if you've got that overlapping agenda, what comes out of it then is a more concentration on personalities. And that's why these 2 old ex-Etonians are going head-to-head on stupid arguments like this. This is far more serious than those sort of remarks. It is a decision once in a lifetime, one that working people should take seriously. The EU is policy made by 28 heads of state, 27 of which we did not elect. We should have a form of running economies and relationships where, as Tony Benn used to say, we know who is elected, what power they have, how they got that power, and at the end of the day, how we can get rid of them. And we can't get rid of those 27 heads of state. And the direction that the EU is taking is not down the road of World War III. Yes, it's talking more about militarisation. Yes, it has foreign policy spokesmen and so on. But fundamentally, it's creating a ground in which the biggest companies in the world, and the biggest European companies can have the economies of scale so they can make bigger profits, and driving down the conditions of working people in order to do that. That's a far more important debate to have than whether the leader of ISIS thinks that it's a good idea or not that we exit the European Union on the 23rd of June.
Emma Reynolds, World War III and Adolf Hitler. What do you make of this?
I think that the public are getting a bit sick of this becoming a blue-on-blue, Tory-on-Tory row, and I think that is regrettable. I think that Boris Johnson's comments about Hitler were frankly obscene and offensive. The EU is a group of independent sovereign nation states that decided to come together in the aftermath of the World War, where millions of people lost their lives. My grandfather fought in that war. I don't know why people feel a necessity to bring Hitler into any debate, frankly. When it comes to the Prime Minister and World War III, I don't think he actually said World War III, but whoever briefed it to the papers might have. And I think, again, there was a mistake there going over the top in his argument. But in the rest of his speech, he made a very good point, which is the security challenges that we face as a country in 21st century do not stop at the White Cliffs of Dover. We will be strengthened by pulling up the drawbridge and going it alone. We share these security challenges, whether it's cross-border crime and terrorism, whether it's climate change, you name it. We share challenges with our European neighbours, and we are much stronger in cooperating with those neighbours in tackling those challenges. So, yes, there's been exaggeration, but there are real big issues here that I would prefer us to be debating than what we talked about earlier.
Andrea Leadsom, Emma Reynolds described what Boris Johnson said as obscene and offensive, and Michael Heseltine used very similar language, preposterous, obscene political remarks. What is your view?
Well, actually, I think neither the Prime Minister talked about World War III, it was attributed to him and he wasn't talking about it, and nor was Boris talking about anything to do with the European Union being anything linked to the Third Reich. And I mean, that was, you know, if you've read the article, what it actually says is that from Roman times through to the modern day, lots of attempts have been made to unite Europe under one banner. And he mentions Napoleon and Hitler. And it's absolutely, I mean, it's absurd to suggest that he was saying that the EU was like the Third Reich. I mean,
he did say that Hitler. He did say that Hitler sought to establish a single authority. Single authority is the word he used.
Yeah.
Added, and it ended tragically. He said the EU is an attempt to do this, establish a single authority, which might be interpreted by some as meaning that that's what Hitler was after.
Okay, well,
the EU is an attempt to do this by different methods.
That's really pushing at a very, very difficult and tenuous relationship. I mean, there is no chance that Boris intended to be suggesting that the EU was like the Third Reich. I'm sorry, I mean, it's just ridiculous, and nor was the Prime Minister really suggesting there would be World War III. But just, I think the important thing that Emma made is that this has to be about the issues and not about this nonsense, this fluff that people just pointing fingers at each other. I mean, I'd just like to say, you know, why should we leave the EU? We're the world's fifth biggest economy. We speak the international business language. We have the world's best contract law. We have the world's least corrupt judicial system. We have 2.3 billion Commonwealth consumers waiting out there to do business with us with the ancient and excellent historic links that we have. We're leading the world in climate change. We have the world's best financial services centre, not just in London, right across this great nation of ours.
But our EU membership is not stopping us.
The world's best universities in the top 10 in the world.
Our EU membership is not stopping us trading with Commonwealth countries.
Yes, of course it is.
Of course it isn't.
No, the European Union has the absolute right to negotiate free trade, and they fail to do so. Switzerland has much greater access to free trade than the European Union does.
And by the way, the Chinese that they have a free trade agreement with have just slapped a 20% tax on Swiss watches, which hasn't gone down very well with their industry.
Luxury watches.
Lopsided trade deals, I think.
The EU hasn't
Are there any
trade agreement
apart from
with
fake
China.
ones? Are there any cheapo Swiss watches?
There are cheap Swiss watches, yes. Swatch, for example. Anyway. buy British, I think.
Are you on the payroll?
No, no, I'd buy British, definitely.
Lord Patten, this Adolf Hitler World War III thing.
Well, I'm
and
glad
whatever
that,
you want
I'm
to add
glad
on the
that
back of it.
Andrea has made clear that David Cameron didn't talk about World War III. He made a speech which basically reflected what had been said by 5 former NATO Secretaries General and virtually all our friends around the world, and I think it is reasonable to listen to them, including Commonwealth leaders, from time to time. On the other hand, I'm afraid Boris did talk about Hitler, and did talk in ways which I found extremely disagreeable before that, about President Obama's mixed race. And you'll excuse me if I feel rather strongly about this, because I have 3 mixed-race grandchildren, and I hope they grow up in a world in which people don't make those sort of remarks about them. People excuse Boris and understand, adds to the gaiety of the nation. People, I mean in the old-fashioned sense, people excuse him on the grounds that he's a historian. So I went back and looked at some of what the historian has told us. And I've actually read his rather good biography of Winston Churchill. Here's a bit of the historian. The European Union has helped deliver a period of peace and prosperity as long as any since the days of Antonine. That's Rome. The importance of a united bulwark of a united Europe as a bulwark against an assertive Russia and other external threats. So what's happened? What happened to that, Boris? I hope he's still alive and well, but it's a different Boris to the one we've heard in this campaign. And there is something which is absolutely consistent this summer. Everything that Boris says against the European Union, he will have said the opposite to that in the last few years. So you can guarantee that as we go forward. So I very much hope that Boris, who was at the same college as me, I'm a great admirer of his father, who's a great environmentalist. I'm a great admirer of his brother, who's a very good higher education minister. But I think Boris has lost the plot for the time being.
Please.
Judith, opinion of the man-only policy at Muirfield Golf Club that has lost them the chance of hosting the Open?
The Royal and Ancient is called, the governing body of British football. That's the problem of being in Newcastle. British golf would not stage it there because it doesn't admit women. Dave Nellist.
I support the decision not to play the Open at Muirfield for the obvious reasons. I think it was a 62% vote, and they have this rule of it having to be 2/3, so it wasn't just a straight 50-50 vote. But Socialists have got a long history of opposing sexism. If I just give the one example of George Lansbury, who went to prison in 1921 with councillors from Tower Hamlets because he refused to implement the cuts from the Liberal-Tory coalition of the day, actually fought a by-election in Bow-and-Bromley in 1914, resigned and fought a by-election exactly on the issue of women's suffrage. So the idea that there should be equal treatment, whether it comes to voting, whether it comes to work, whether it comes to playing a sport and so on, is a thread that runs long and deep in the Labour and trade union movement. I mean, the idea that men-only clubs or such things should still exist in the 21st century, just frankly is so absurd. I don't think I need to make any more points. I fully support the idea of not playing the
We'll go to our next question.
Lindsay James. Has the Supreme Court's ruling on the celebrity threesome injunction created a de facto privacy law in England?
This has caused a huge fuss because the newspapers concerned are up in arms at the judgment. It's a story that has surfaced elsewhere in the world, notably on websites, online, and it's about apparently 2 celebrities. It involves 3 individuals and olive oil. Is it effectively a privacy law being introduced, is the question. Dave Nellist.
That's the second time you've come to me straight away on a
Would you
easy
like me to
one
start?
to answer. I actually confess I haven't read the judgment or followed the case very closely. Again, I'm going to be honest when you said earlier on about realising when I'd said a sufficiently short answer. And that's partly because I'm not bloody interested. And I don't think... And I don't think we should be, but it probably does, if I was to go away and do the research, illustrate the fact that if you've got celebrity status and the money, that you can buy privacy, which if you were somebody claiming income support and doing a couple of hours window cleaning on the side, I'm fairly sure the DWP would not respect that privacy, and you'd be investigated. So there are those sort of wider issues I could develop if we had unlimited time in the programme, but on the basic issue of what they get up to in their beds, I'm not bloody interested.
I'm not sure it was beds since olive oil was involved.
No one knows, or actually quite a lot of people know, but those who do know can't speak, and those who don't know can't speak. Interestingly, if I may observe, when this kind of issue has come up before, audiences always massively applaud at what, Dave, you just said. Some of them are the same audiences that read the newspapers, that have those stories, because that's what sells the stories. I'm not saying anyone here, of course, of whom that could be true. I just note it in passing.
Mary Piggott, if the panellists could use their influence, who would they have as the next James Bond?
The next James Bond. I won't, I promise you, come... You know who James Bond is, Dave, but I won't come to you first. Emma Reynolds.
Idris Elba. First black James Bond.
Fine. Chris Patten.
Either Sam Steedon from South Ealing or Max Meikle from East Sheen in London, two of my 8-year-old grandsons who have moved, who have moved from looking at the Jedi to being passionate about James Bond. They know every James Bond film which is a PG, and I think they would be very, very good, witty, fairly out of control, but very good with motor vehicles.
Andrea.
So I'm going to deliberately try and buy back my son's friendship by saying Rory McIlroy.
Because you know he'd approve.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Dave, Nellist.
Well, since Idris Elba's gone, I'm going to go for a Jeanette Bond. Well done. But I'll also make the point that I think MI5 and MI6 should be closed down. I'm one of the dozen Labour MPs, or in my case, ex-Labour MPs, who were investigated and spied on by MI5 in the 1980s, and I'm what's called a permitted participant in the Pitchford inquiry. Lord Justice Pitchford is conducting an inquiry into the roles of the James Bonds on domestic soil, when myself and a number of others were investigated, including the Lawrence family and so on. So if you'll forgive me ending on not quite a humorous note, I think we should investigate the powers of those organisations as well.
And leave